Hey everyone, I'm Desmond. Thank you guys for tuning in today. Today's video, I want to talk about whether or not you should feed your ball pythons or snakes in general live prey or go the frozen thawed route. So basically, I'm going to break this down to the pros and cons of each, and then I'm going to give you guys my personal experiences and which route I chose and why I chose that route. So with that being said, let's dive into it. All right, everyone. So first I'm going to talk about live prey and the pros of using live prey as your primary source of feeding, So first and foremost, one of the good pros of feeding live is you're going to get a stronger feeding response. So movement triggers natural hunting instincts. Just like in the wild, your snake is going to be eating live prey, not frozen thawed. So, that's one of the major pro aspects right there of feeding your ball python live. Sorry, I keep looking at my cheat sheet as well because I just came up with some notes and kind of what I wanted to discuss. So also another pro for feeding live would be helping the picky eaters. And some of my experiences, I've had some picky eaters in the past. So feeding live really helps with picky eaters. So that's good. And transitioning to feeding as well off the rip for hatchlings and stuff like that can kind of be difficult to start off with a frozen thawed animal, and feeding live is just the more natural route that kind of helps them, get that feeding response. And which makes me want to jump on the topic that it's what some breeders or keepers feel that is more natural because it's a live prey and that's what takes place out in the wild. Obviously this is captive bred, but this is in captivity, so you can choose what you choose. But so let's dive into some of the cons for live feeding. Obviously one of the most concerning con would be risk or injury. That's a big one. Scratch bites, scratches, bites, infections from those, which can then lead to a bigger problem, vet bills, such things like those. Obviously you want to avoid those, but those are all things that can happen with the live prey option. With that being said, you should always supervise when you're feeding live. You should not leave you shouldn't just shut the tub and just go to the grocery store and come back. I definitely would not recommend that because that's when things happen. You come back and your snake's got cuts all over, or the worst things can happen and when you least expect it, and that's something you don't want. And that's another thing that is a con. It's tough for it concerns ethical reasonings for some keepers, which is understandable. All right, I'm not here to judge anybody. And also live is it's harder to save, store. It's harder to store and maintain unless you're like breeding them. That's just a whole nother process you have to do if you are going to breed your own prey, rats, mice, whatever you choose. That can become definitely a tough task. You got to keep up on the maintenance, stuff like that. It causes smell issues, food costs, because at the end of the day, it's going to cost more if you're breeding them, or if you are going to pick them up. Sometimes if you go to pick them up at like whatever store you pick them up, or if you have a local breeder, they might not have the size you need or the quantity of the size that you need. So that's also a con for the live prey option. So now let's dive into the frozen thawed aspect of feeding. I'll start off with the pros. Obviously, it being much more safer. You don't have to worry about snake bites, scratches, infections, vet bills, etc. So that's one of the most probably number one reason that most people use the frozen thawed route. That on top of it's the more humane way to, feed a prey item to the snake, even though they at some point there was something that took place for them to become frozen thawed. So that's just some people's aspects around that whole humane concern, ethical reasonings. So also frozen thawed pros would be they're readily available. So kind of to stem off the concern that it can be to get live animals, these frozen thawed rats, mice, whatever size prey you use, they're readily available and usually easier to come by, and you can store them in your own freezer, chest freezer, whatever. You can always store them and have enough for your collection, as long as that you buy enough in the first place. So they're convenient storage, readily available. So they're also consistent with the sizing availability. Like I said, with the live prey, it's kind of difficult at times, if you need a certain size for your snake. So they're pretty the availability is usually there for certain different sizes, whether it's a pinky, medium, large, whatever you're looking for, it's more available. And then this is one of the reasons that people do choose that. One of the big cons would be some of the snakes in your collection or your pet in general. Some snakes might refuse it at first, and this can kind of cause a lot of stress, not on just you as the owner, the keeper, but also on the snake, because you're constantly trying to agitate it kind of to get it to strike and take the frozen thawed meal. So it takes time, and that also leads to it might not happen off the first try, it might not happen off the second try, it might not happen off the third try. It may take multiple attempts to get the snake on a frozen thawed prey item, and that definitely can cause concern if you have a good size collection, and it definitely can be stressful, on you and on the snake if you're constantly agitating it, trying to get it to eat. So that's one of the cons. It also requires a lot more of a process. Feeding wise, you have to properly have it at a certain temp, make sure it's fully thawed out. There's a process that's required for the frozen thawed feeding aspect. Also, a con would be less movement, which can kind of reduce the feeding response. So it's not gonna get the movement that a live prey would give off when they're moving around or whatever. And like I said, it's going to require a lot of patience for the transition period. So if you get a snake from someone that's used to eating live, then you have to go back to frozen thawed. The transition period can really be a long time, unless you get a snake that just doesn't really care and just takes it, and well, that's good. But that's not always the case. And also, it can cost a lot of money. If you don't figure out your collection, who takes what, doing the frozen thawed route, you say you unthaw or you thaw out 10 rats and you got 10 snakes in your collection. Well, one of your snakes not going to take, so you just spent all this time defrosting a snake or a rat, sorry, and the snake doesn't take. Well, now you have to figure out what you're going to do with it. You're most likely going to have to toss it if the snake doesn't take it, and those can definitely add up. You know, you're wasting a couple of dollars a rat, depending on the size prey you use or the species prey. So that definitely can be a concern with the frozen thawed avenue if you go that way. So like I said, it takes a lot of time, especially if you have a big collection. Say, for my collection as an example, I only have 10 snakes, so it's not that big of a collection. But say you're feeding like 30, 40 snakes, that can really be a 2-3 hour process. You know, you're trying to make sure each snake eats. They might not take it right away. You have to fiddle around with the rat or whatever, and it definitely can be time consuming. So that also is a con in my part of the frozen thawed feeding. So let's kind of stem off those. There is no there is no one size fits all answer for this. You know, it's the best choice is what's best for the snake. Whatever keeps your snake feeding constantly, less stress-free and consistently, safely, is the answer that you should go with. So based on my experiences, I started off with the frozen thawed route, just because I was very, I don't want to say I was against feeding live, but in my eyes, you know, when I first got my first snake, I wanted to make sure it didn't get bit, it didn't have any issues with that, draw any concern of, you know, having to take it to the vet or anything. So I definitely did not want to harm the snake. I also would take the snake out of the tub that it was in, or the gallon tanks that I had at the time, and I would put them in a separate bin and then, you know, feed them, just so I didn't get bit. You know, there's a lot of mystery things that can happen that I just kind of listened to, and I thought that was the case. So I should definitely breed it this way, I should definitely feed it this way, I should do this, do that. And it's kind of, you gotta take these things into account, and, you know, kind of listen, and, you know, go with your own experiences and how things go. So this is what I did. Basically, based off of my collection size, I decided that switching over to live was the best route for me, because I would spend so much time trying to feed 10 snakes frozen thawed, and then I'd have two, three not even eat them just because they didn't want it, and I was wasting a lot of prey, and it adds up over time. So that's one reason why the feeding response just wasn't there. And once I switched over to live prey, actually not too long ago, about 8 months ago I switched over, and I've never had a snake miss a meal. The feeding response is so much better. I've never had a snake miss a meal, like I said, but I also monitor the feeding times. You know, if I go, I don't sit there and stare and watch them eat it, obviously, but I'm not gonna leave a rat in the tub with a snake for 2-3 hours and then just hope everything's okay. I'm not gonna leave a rat overnight. Sure as hell they're not gonna do that. You do not want to do that, because that's when things happen. I put a rat in, check it 10 minutes later, 5 minutes later, and make sure everything's okay. If I see that the snake is not taking after 5-10 minutes, I'm gonna just take it out and put it back, and then try another day. You know, because that's when the issues happen. The snake, or the rat bites the snake, stuff like that, and that's nothing I want over here. So that's one thing. I also make sure I'm using the appropriate size. So I'm not gonna go grabbing a large female ASF rat and throw it in with a small snake, because that's when the snake's not gonna try to take, and eventually something probably will happen. The rat would probably take matters in his own hand. So that's something I would never do. Make sure that the appropriate size is what you're feeding, whether that's frozen thawed or live. That just goes hand in hand. And make sure you're monitoring the snakes and the rat if you do feed live. Like I said, I always monitor and do not leave unattended for long periods of time. So overall, this is what works best for me over here at my place with my snakes. And feel free to leave a comment below on your experiences, what you guys think. And I'd love to hear what you guys do and why you do what you do. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.